Annie Besant's Support for Women's Rights by Dave Marsland of Cardiff Theosophical Society. Annie Besant was a strong supporter of women's rights and believed that women should have equal access to education, employment and political power. She argued that the patriarchal system of society, which at the time denied women the vote, served to oppress women, and that campaigning for social reform offered a way to redress that balance. She envisioned a world in which women had the opportunity to achieve their full potential, free from the constraints of gender-based discrimination. Besant also believed in the power of education to effect social change. She was a proponent of the idea that the working class should be educated and empowered to take control of their lives. She saw education as a means of elevating the working class and promoting social equality. Annie Besant's campaign for women's rights is legendary in the history of the feminist movement. Besant, a British activist, theosophist and writer, was a trailblazer for women's rights and a leading light in the struggle for gender equality. Her tireless work in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries transformed the way women were perceived and treated in society, paving the way for future generations of women who have benefited from her legacy. Annie Besant was born in 1847 and grew up in a world that was deeply entrenched in patriarchy. Women had few rights and were expected to conform to traditional gender roles, with marriage and motherhood being seen as their primary functions. However, Besant was a woman who refused to be defined by the narrow constraints imposed upon her gender. She was fiercely proactive and independent and was determined to make a difference in the world. Besant's campaign for women's rights began in earnest in the 1870s, when she became involved with the National Secular Society, a group that championed the separation of church and state. Besant saw the fight for women's rights as part of a broader struggle for social justice, and she used her position within the society to advocate for gender equality. In 1874, she published an article, later issued as a pamphlet, entitled "The Political Status of Women," which argued that women should have the right to vote and hold public office. This was a radical idea at the time, but Besant was undaunted. Although more of a social struggle, the Brighton May Match Girls strike of 1888 raised issues concerning the treatment of women in British industry and the indifference of employers. It is considered one of the most significant labour protests in British history. This industrial action was primarily led by Annie Besant, and with her high-profile leadership it became a national issue. Besant's contribution to the struggle of the match girls was instrumental in raising awareness of the inhumane working conditions and the use of phosphorus prevalent in London's match factories during the late 19th century. After Annie Besant's attention was initially drawn to the London match factory in Bow in 1888, she noticed and documented the appalling conditions of the mostly young female workers. These match girls were subject to long hours of work in a hazardous environment where diseases caused by white phosphorus exposure were rampant. Furthermore, the girls received poor remuneration and were subject to arbitrary pay deductions. It is worth noting that it was during this period that workers had no rights to join a union and negotiate their working conditions. Under Besant's leadership, the factory owners soon conceded to the demands of the match girls. Workers received improved pay, their working hours were reduced, and they were provided with safer working conditions. White phosphorus was eventually made illegal, but this took nearly 30 years to achieve. Besant's commitment to women's rights was not limited to her advocacy work. She also founded several organisations that were dedicated to the cause, including the Women's Free Thought League and the International Order of Co-Freemasonry, which was open to both men and women. She also supported the suffrage movement and worked closely with leaders such as Emmeline Pankhurst and Millicent Fawcett. At the heart of Besant's agenda was a deep commitment to social justice. She believed that society was fundamentally unjust and sought a way to create a fairer and more equitable society for both men and women.